Dawn breaks over Redemption Creek, casting long shadows across the freshly built gallows. Sarah Matthews stands in her cell, clutching a locket containing the only picture of her son. They say she killed a man in cold blood, but all she did was protect her child. With no family, no lawyer, and no hope left, she prepares to meet her maker as the town prepares for her hanging. But fate has other plans. Just as the morning sun touches the horizon, hoofbeats thunder through the empty streets. A stranger arrives, wealthy, powerful, and bearing evidence that will shake this frontier town to its core. Could the real killer be someone the townsfolk trust? Someone hiding behind a mask of respectability? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver locket caught the last rays of sunset as Sarah Matthews threaded her needle with practiced precision. Even in the dimming light of her modest shop, her fingers never missed a stitch. The worn wooden sign outside read, "Matthews Fine Tailoring," though most folks in Redemption Creek simply called it Sarah's Place. It wasn't much, but it was honest work that put food on the table and kept Timothy in school shoes. "Mama, look what I drew today." Timothy burst through the door, his 8-year-old enthusiasm sending the shop bell into a frenzied dance. Sarah carefully set aside Mrs. Henderson's wedding dress alterations and turned to catch her son's whirlwind entrance. His dark curls, so like his father's, were tousled from the autumn wind. "Show me, darling," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Timothy thrust forward a carefully drawn picture of their little house, complete with the morning glory vines she'd planted last. Spring. In the drawing, 2 stick figures stood hand in hand, one tall, one small, both wearing what appeared to be matching smiles. "That's us," he declared proudly, pointing to the figures. "And look, I even drew Shadow." A black blob with 4 legs represented the stray cat that had adopted their back porch as its home 3 months ago. Sarah pulled him close, breathing in the familiar scent of chalk dust and penny candy. "It's beautiful, Timothy. We'll hang it right here by my work table." The boy beamed as she pinned the drawing to the wall alongside his other masterpieces, a growing gallery of childhood imagination. The shop had been her salvation after Thomas died. 4 years ago, the influenza had swept through town like wildfire, leaving too many graves and too many widows in its wake. Sarah had been one of the lucky ones. She had a trade, a roof over her head, and most importantly, she had Timothy. She glanced at the clock on the wall, its steady ticking a reminder of evening duties yet to come. "Time for your studies, young man. Miss Wilson tells me you're making fine progress with your numbers." Timothy's face scrunched up in mock protest, but he obediently retrieved his slate and primer from the shelf where they kept his school things. Sarah had insisted on keeping them in the shop. It let her mind rest easier, having him close by while she worked. The bell chimed again as Martha Whitaker entered, carrying her Sunday best that needed letting out. "Evening, Sarah. Timothy, my, how you've grown." Martha's kind eyes crinkled at the corners as she set her bundle on the counter. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitaker," Timothy replied politely, already absorbed in his arithmetic. Sarah unwrapped the dress, her fingers automatically finding the seams that would need attention. "I can have this ready by Friday if that suits." "That would be just fine, dear. And—" Martha lowered her voice, glancing at Timothy. "I brought you some of that beef stew I made." Times being what they are, I thought. Well, a growing boy needs his meat. Sarah's throat tightened with gratitude. Since Thomas's passing, the townspeople had shown kindnesses large and small. It wasn't charity they insisted. It was community. "Thank you, Martha. You're too good to us." After Martha left, Sarah worked until the light faded completely, finishing Mrs. Henderson's dress by lamplight. Timothy had fallen asleep over his slate, his peaceful breathing a counterpoint to the clock's steady rhythm. She gathered him up, his lanky frame already testing the limits of her strength, and carried him to the small cot in the back room. Later, after banking the stove and locking up, Sarah stood in the doorway of their tiny home behind the shop. The street was quiet now, most of Redemption Creek's residents already tucked in for the night. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine from the surrounding hills, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. She touched the locket at her throat, Thomas's last gift to her, and whispered a prayer of thanks for another day of simple blessings, work for her hands, food for their table, and the sound of her son's laughter. Tomorrow would bring what it would, but for now, in this moment, they were safe, they were together, and they were blessed. If only she had known then how quickly their world would shatter. The oil lamp cast uncertain shadows as Sarah worked late into the night. Judge Carlton's wife needed her mourning dress altered before tomorrow's funeral, and Sarah wouldn't disappoint her best-paying customer. Outside, the October wind rattled. The shop's windows, carrying winter's first bitter promise. The sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet. Sarah froze, needle poised mid-stitch. The noise had come from the back room where Timothy slept. Her heart stopped when she heard his frightened cry, "Mama!" She knocked over her chair in her haste, the lamp in her hand throwing wild shadows as she rushed toward her son's voice. The back door hung open, cold wind whipping the curtains. A man's broad silhouette filled the doorway, and Timothy struggled in his grip. "Let him go!" The words tore from her throat, primal and fierce. The intruder's laugh was whiskey rough. "Shut your mouth, woman. You'll give us what we came for, or the boy gets hurt." Sarah's hand tightened around the lamp. "Please, Timothy has nothing to do with this. Whatever you want." "The deed, Mrs. Matthews." A second voice from the shadows, cultured and cold. "We know Thomas left it with you." The deed, of course, the worthless piece of paper Thomas had insisted she hide, pressing it into her hands the night before the fever took him. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her eyes flickered to the loose floorboard beneath Timothy's bed. The second man stepped into the lamplight. Sarah recognized him with a jolt. Gerald Blackwood, the banker's brother. His usually immaculate suit was rumpled, his eyes fever-bright with greed or drink. "Search the place," he ordered his companion, who shoved Timothy roughly aside. The boy stumbled, hitting his head against the bedpost with a sickening crack. Something snapped inside Sarah. She lunged forward, swinging the oil lamp with all her strength. It caught Gerald across the face, shattering in a spray of glass and burning oil. His screams filled the small room as flames caught his clothing. He staggered, arms windmilling, and crashed into his accomplice. "Timothy, run!" Sarah grabbed her son's hand, pulling him past the struggling men, but Gerald, still burning, caught her skirt. She kicked free, hearing fabric tear, smelling singed wool and something worse. They ran into the street, Sarah half carrying Timothy. Behind them, orange light bloomed in the shop windows. "Fire!" she screamed. "Help! Fire!" Doors opened along the street. Men emerged with buckets, women gathered children close. And there, sprawled in her doorway, Gerald Blackwood lay ominously still, his fine suit now a charred ruin. Sheriff Turner's heavy hand fell on her shoulder. "Don't move, Mrs. Matthews!" His deputy was already checking Gerald's body. The gathered crowd grew deathly quiet, waiting. The deputy looked up, his face grim. "He's dead, Sheriff." Sarah felt Timothy's small hand squeeze hers as the cold steel of handcuffs circled her wrists. "It was self-defense," she pleaded. "They broke in. They threatened my son." But she saw in the townspeople's faces that they'd already made their judgment. Gerald Blackwood might have been a drunkard and a scoundrel, but he was still a Blackwood, and she was just a widow who'd killed a prominent man's brother. "Mama?" Timothy's voice quavered. "Don't let them take her." "Martha!" Sarah called to her friend in the crowd. "Please, take care of Timothy, just until this is sorted out." Martha stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, and gathered the struggling boy into her arms. "Hush now, child. Your mama needs you to be brave." As Sheriff Turner led her away, Sarah looked back one last time. The shop, their home, their livelihood, was fully engulfed now. Everything they'd built, everything they'd saved, disappeared into the hungry flames. But worse than the loss of their worldly possessions was the sight of Timothy's face, lit by the inferno, screaming for his mother as she was led away into the darkness. The dead man's companion had vanished into the night, taking with him any hope of corroborating her story. And somewhere in the burning building, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, a land deed turned to ashes, taking with it the secret that had cost Gerald Blackwood his life. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the cramped courthouse like a gunshot. Judge Carlton adjusted his black robes, his expression carved from granite as he gazed down at Sarah. 3 days of imprisonment had left her dress soot-stained and wrinkled, her hair falling loose from its once neat bun. "Order," he commanded. Though the packed courtroom was already deathly silent, the territory of Montana versus Sarah Matthews, charged with the murder of Gerald Blackwood. Sarah's court-appointed lawyer, young Peter Hayes, shuffled his papers. Nervously, fresh from law school back east, he'd never handled a murder trial. His hands trembled as he adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Your Honor," Hayes began, his voice cracking, "my client acted in defense of her child." "Objection!" Augustus Blackwood, the victim's brother and town banker, rose from his seat beside the prosecutor. "Counsel is attempting to present unsubstantiated claims as fact." Judge Carlton's gavel fell again. "Sustained, Mr. Hayes. Confine yourself to the evidence at hand." But what evidence? The fire had destroyed everything. The mysterious second man had vanished. And Timothy? They wouldn't let her 8-year-old boy testify, claiming he was too young and too biased to be reliable. "Call your first witness." The judge instructed the prosecutor, Winston Reed, a man who owed his position and his gambling debts to the Blackwood family. Reed called the undertaker first, who detailed Gerald's burns in gruesome terms that made the ladies in the gallery fan themselves and murmur sympathetically. Next came Sheriff Turner, describing how he'd found Sarah at the scene, her skirts singed, standing over the victim's body. "And did the accused make any statement at the time?" Reed asked. "She claimed self-defense," Turner admitted. "Said there was another man, that they were after some deed," he paused. "But we found no evidence of forced entry, and no sign of this supposed second intruder." Sarah's heart sank as she watched the jury nodding. 12 men, half of them in debt to Blackwood's bank, the other half dependent on his goodwill for their businesses to survive. Hayes tried his best in cross-examination, but his questions were met with constant objections, most sustained before witnesses could answer. When he attempted to introduce evidence of Gerald's notorious drinking and gambling, Judge Carlton shut him down completely. "The victim's personal habits are not on trial here," the judge declared, though everyone in town knew of Gerald's violent tendencies when drunk. Finally, Augustus Blackwood himself took the stand. His black mourning suit was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly combed. He dabbed at his eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief as he described his beloved younger brother. "Gerald was turning his life around," Augustus claimed, his voice thick with manufactured grief. "He'd recently discovered God's grace. He was even doing charity work, helping widows manage their affairs." His cold eyes fixed on Sarah. "Some people sadly take advantage of such kindness." Sarah felt bile rise in her throat at this twisting of the truth. But when Hayes rose to cross-examine, Augustus's answers were perfectly crafted to suggest that Sarah had lured Gerald to her shop, with promises of repaying her late husband's debts, only to murder him in cold blood. The trial lasted barely 3 days. Hayes's closing argument was passionate but disorganized, full of objections and stumbles. Reed's, by contrast, was a masterpiece of manipulation, painting Sarah as a scheming widow who'd murdered a prominent citizen to avoid her obligations. When the jury returned after less than an hour of deliberation, Sarah already knew her fate. The foreman, whose mortgage was held by Blackwood's bank, wouldn't meet her eyes as he pronounced her guilty. Judge Carlton's sentence came swiftly. "Sarah Matthews, you have been found guilty of the murder of Gerald Blackwood. The sentence of this court is that you shall be hanged by the neck until dead, the execution to be carried out at dawn, 3 days hence." The gallery erupted in shocked whispers. Even for a murder conviction, such a swift execution was unusual. But then, Augustus Blackwood had always believed in expedient justice when it suited his purposes. "Your Honor," Hayes protested, "I move for a stay of execution pending appeal." "Denied." The gavel fell one final time. "Court is adjourned," as the sheriff led her away. Sarah caught a glimpse of Martha Whitaker in the gallery, tears streaming down her face. But it was the absence that broke her heart. Timothy, her precious boy, kept away from his mother's shame. That night in her cell, Sarah clutched Thomas's locket and wondered if she'd ever learn what secret had been worth killing for. Whatever was in that deed, it would die with her at dawn in 3 days' time, unless fate or God had other plans. The stranger arrived as the moon set, his black stallion's hooves striking sparks from Redemption Creek's cobblestones. The town slept fitfully, waiting for dawn and its grim promise. Only the saloon showed signs of life, light spilling from its windows like wounded gold. He dismounted with fluid grace, his movements suggesting a man accustomed to authority. A gold-plated pocket watch gleamed as he checked the time. 3 hours until sunrise, 3 hours until they hanged Sarah Matthews. The saloon fell silent as he entered, conversations dying mid-sentence. He cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black duster that had seen its share of trail dust. But it was his face that drew the stares, a face that several patrons recognized, though none had seen it in nearly 2 decades. "James Blackwood," Augustus whispered, his whiskey glass frozen halfway to his lips. "What in God's name are you doing here?" The prodigal son of Redemption Creek's most powerful family smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hello, Uncle. We need to talk about Gerald." Augustus recovered quickly, gesturing to his private table. Of course, though I'd have expected you at the funeral, not the execution. The timing isn't coincidental." James settled into the chair opposite his. "Uncle," declining the offered whiskey, "I've spent the last week riding hard from Denver, following a trail of corruption that led straight home." "Careful, boy," Augustus growled softly. "Family loyalty doesn't extend to murder." James withdrew a leather folio from his coat. "I'm here as an agent of the Territory Marshal's office. We've been building a case against land fraud in the region. Imagine my surprise when my own uncle's name kept appearing in the documents." Augustus's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened around his glass. "You always were a self-righteous pup. Your father was a good man who died questioning where his brother's sudden wealth came from." James leaned forward. "The widow you're hanging at dawn? Her husband's land deed is the missing piece that proves everything." "The deed burned," Augustus said flatly. "Did it?" James withdrew an envelope, aged and creased but intact. Thomas Matthews was smarter than that. He sent a copy to the Denver land office before he died, with a letter explaining exactly what he'd discovered. The color drained from Augustus's face. In the lamplight, he suddenly looked old and afraid. "Release." James said quietly. "Call off the hanging, or I submit this evidence to the territorial governor at first light. You destroy your own family." "You did that yourself, Uncle. I'm just here to stop you from adding an innocent woman's blood to your hands." Augustus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Sheriff," he called, "arrest this man for interfering with the in course of justice." But Sheriff Turner, who had been listening from the bar, didn't move. He'd seen the marshal's star, James, now displayed, and more importantly, he'd seen the fear in Augustus Blackwood's eyes. The winds of power were shifting in Redemption Creek. "I'll need to see that evidence properly filed," Turner said carefully. "And Judge Carlton will have to be awakened to stay the execution. Then I suggest we hurry." James rose, towering over. His uncle. Dawn waits for no man's convenience. In her cell, Sarah sat motionless, watching the stars fade through her barred window. She'd made her peace, written her letter to Timothy, though her tears had smeared the ink. The locket lay heavy against her heart, holding not just her son's picture, but now a lock of her hair for him to remember her by. The sound of multiple footsteps approaching made her close her eyes. Was it time already? Mrs. Matthews, an unfamiliar voice, deep and gentle. "My name is James Blackwood." Her eyes flew open. A stranger stood before her cell, his presence somehow filling the small space with quiet authority. Behind him, she glimpsed Sheriff Turner and Judge Carlton, the latter hastily dressed and scowling. "I know you have no reason to trust my family." "Name," James continued, "but I'm here to prove your innocence. With your permission, I'd like to tell you exactly how my uncle and my late brother framed you for murder." Sarah rose on shaking legs, hope warring with disbelief. "Why would you help me?" James's eyes, she noticed, were kind. Nothing like Gerald's cold gaze or Augustus's calculating stare. "Because 20 years ago, I made a promise to my father on his deathbed. Today, I finally keep it." The first light of dawn crept through the window, but for the first time in 3 days, its arrival brought not dread, but the possibility of salvation. In Judge Carlton's private chambers, James spread the contents of his leather journal across the mahogany desk. Dawn had come and gone, and with it, Sarah's scheduled execution. Now she sat, still in shackles but very much alive, watching as James methodically built his case. "These land transfers," he said, laying out a series of documents, "all follow the same pattern. Homesteaders die unexpectedly, their widows sell for pennies on the dollar, and the property ends up in Blackwood, holdings through a maze of shell companies." The judge's face had grown increasingly ashen as he examined each paper. "This is quite thorough, Marshal. 20 years' worth of theft and murder, Your Honor." James's voice carried the weight of long-buried truth. "My father suspected it. Before he died. That's why he sent me away to law school, to learn how to fight this legally." Sarah leaned forward, her chains clinking. "Thomas, he discovered something, didn't he? That's why they killed him." James nodded grimly. "The influenza that took your husband wasn't entirely natural. Gerald had been experimenting with contaminating water supplies on properties they wanted to acquire. Thomas found evidence in the mining company's records." Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, bile rising in her throat. "All those deaths, all those widows and orphans? Dear God. That's why he gave you the deed to protect," James continued. "It wasn't just a property document, it was proof. The original survey map showed where the contaminated wells were located. Augustus and Gerald had to destroy it before anyone could connect the deaths to their land grabs." Sheriff Turner, standing by the door, cursed softly. "I knew Gerald was a devil, but this—" "Your brother wasn't acting alone," James told Sarah quietly. "The night he died, he was desperate. Augustus had cut off his funds, blamed him for getting sloppy. Gerald thought if he could retrieve the deed, he could blackmail his way back into favor." Judge Carlton shifted uncomfortably. "Marshal, these accusations against one of our most prominent citizens include your name, Carlton." James withdrew another document from his journal. "This bank draft shows exactly how much Augustus paid you to rush Mrs. Matthews's trial and sentence." The judge's face turned purple. "Now see here, I see perfectly well." James's hand rested meaningfully on his marshal's star. "The only question is whether you'll sign Mrs. Matthews's release and testify against Augustus, or, if you'd prefer, sharing his cell in the territorial prison." A heavy silence filled the chamber. Through the window, they could hear the ordinary sounds of Redemption Creek awakening: wagon wheels, merchants' calls, children's voices. A world continuing as if the foundations of its power weren't crumbling. "In this very room, Sarah," James turned to her, his voice softening, "there's something else you should know about Timothy." Her heart clenched. He's safe." "But Augustus sent men to Martha Whitaker's house last night. He knew I was coming, tried to use your son as leverage." James's jaw tightened. "Fortunately, I had friends watching. Timothy's under protection at the marshal's office in Helena." Tears of relief spilled down Sarah's cheeks. Then anger blazed through her as the full scope of Augustus's crimes became clear. All those families, all those children orphaned, just for land, money, power. James's expression hardened. Augustus never saw people, only profits. Even his own family were just pieces on a chessboard. Judge Carlton cleared his throat. I'll need time to review these materials properly. You have 1 hour. James's tone brooked no argument. By noon, I want Mrs. Matthews formally exonerated and Augustus Blackwood in custody. After that, every document in this journal goes to the territorial governor. The judge nodded weakly, reaching for his quill. Sarah watched as he began writing. Her release order, each scratch of the pen bringing her closer to freedom. But knowledge of the larger horror, the systematic destruction of so many lives, weighed heavily on her soul. What happens now? She asked James softly. He met her eyes, and in his steady gaze she saw not just the law's authority, but a deep personal commitment to justice. Now, Mrs. Matthews, we make them answer for everything, every widow, every orphan, every stolen dream. Starting with your husband's murder. The morning light strengthened, drawing long shadows across the chamber floor. Somewhere in those shadows, Sarah could almost glimpse Thomas's smile, could almost hear him whisper that truth, like dawn, could not be forever denied. In the wreckage of Sarah's burned shop, James knelt beside the charred floorboards, his fingers tracing the edge of Timothy's hidden sleeping space. Sarah stood in the doorway, breathing in the lingering scent of smoke and memories. Gerald wasn't always a monster, James said quietly, prying up a blackened board. When we were boys, he was different, softer. It was Augustus who twisted him. How? Sarah wrapped her shawl tighter against the morning chill. By showing him that cruelty paid better than kindness. James reached into the hollow space, retrieving a metal strongbox, its surface scarred but intact. Gerald was 16 when Augustus first asked him to poison a well, made him believe it was a test of loyalty. Sarah watched as James worked the box's lock. And you? I refused. That's when Father realized what his brother had become. The lock clicked open. He started gathering evidence, but Augustus found out. 3 days later, Father was dead. A riding accident. Inside the box lay a bundle of papers, their edges singed but legible. James lifted them carefully, revealing a blood-stained land deed beneath. Gerald's last victim fought back, he explained. A homesteader named Michael Burke. The blood on this deed belongs to him. Sarah sank to her knees beside James. How many? How many families did they destroy? 43 deeds. James spread the papers before them. 43 properties acquired through murder, blackmail and fraud. Each one representing a family shattered, children orphaned, wives widowed. He paused. Your Thomas was the 44th. Oh, shadow darkened the doorway. Sheriff Turner stepped carefully through the debris. Marshal, Augustus's office is secure. You need to see what we found. They followed Turner to the bank, where deputies stood guard. Augustus's private office had been stripped bare, its walls now exposed. Behind a hidden panel, they discovered leather-bound ledgers dating back 20 years. It's all here, James said, scanning the meticulous records. Every murder, every theft, every bribed official. Augustus documented everything. His expression hardened, including orders for Gerald to kill Thomas Matthews. Sarah's fingers trembled as she touched the relevant page. There, in precise handwriting, was the price of her husband's life. $50 for contaminated well water, $25 for the doctor's silence. Thomas wasn't their only target that month, James continued, turning pages. They poisoned 3 wells along Copper Creek. 12 people died in total. He looked at Sarah. Your husband's death was meant to look like just another influenza victim. But Thomas knew, Sarah whispered. That's why he gave me the deed. Yes. James withdrew an envelope from his coat, and this is what he sent to Denver before he died. The original survey map showing every contaminated well, every murdered homesteader, every stolen property. He marked them all, The map, when unfolded, told its story in red ink crosses. Each mark represented a family destroyed, a property stolen, a life ended. The pattern was clear. Augustus had been systematically seizing every piece of land with water rights, creating a stranglehold on the region's future development. Gerald came to your shop that night because he was desperate, James explained. He'd learned that Thomas's evidence had survived, that I was closing in. He thought if he could retrieve the deed, he could buy his way out before everything collapsed. But why bring Timothy into it? Sarah's voice shook with remembered fear. Because Gerald was a coward at heart. He knew you'd hidden the deed, knew you'd never give it up willingly. So he used the one thing that could break you, your son. Sarah stood at the bank's window, watching townsfolk gather in the street below. News of Augustus's arrest was spreading, along with whispers of the horrible truth. What happens to them now? She asked. All those widows and orphans. James joined her at the window. The territorial governor has ordered all stolen properties returned to their rightful heirs. Those who lost family members will receive compensation from seized Blackwood assets. He paused. It won't bring back the dead, but it's something. And Augustus, he'll hang. James's voice carried absolute certainty. For Thomas, for my father, for every life he destroyed. Gerald's death may have started this, but Augustus's greed will end it. Through the window, they watched as deputies led Augustus Blackwood down the street in chains. The once mighty banker shuffled in silence, his empire crumbling with each step. Thomas would be proud, Sarah said softly. He died protecting the truth. Yes. James's hand found hers, strong and steady. And now the truth will protect those he left behind. The telegraph office's brass bell jangled urgently as messages poured in from across the territory. Sarah watched James's face darken as he read each yellow slip. Augustus's friends are moving fast, he said, passing her the latest dispatch. Judge Morton in Helena has called an emergency hearing. Claims we acted without proper authority. Sarah scanned the message, her heart sinking. Can they really stop this? They can try. James began pacing the small office. Half the territorial court owns land acquired through Augustus's schemes. They're fighting for their own survival now. The telegraph operator, young Billy Jenkins, burst through the door. Marshal, urgent wire from Denver. His face was pale as he handed over the message. James read it quickly, his jaw tightening. They've taken Timothy. Sarah's world tilted. But you said he was protected. He was. At the marshal's office in Helena, James crumpled the telegram. Judge Morton had him removed to protective custody pending review of your case. They're using him as leverage. No. The word came out as a whisper, then built to a scream. No, they can't have my son. James caught her shoulders as her knees buckled. Listen to me, Sarah. I won't let them hurt him. I promise you that. Another telegram arrived, this one addressed to Sarah. She recognized Augustus's elegant hand, even in the terse telegraph style. Withdraw your testimony. Stop sign, confession of Gerald's murder. Stop, your son's safety depends. On your cooperation, stop. I'll do it, she said immediately. Whatever they want, no. James's voice was steel. The moment you confess, they'll hang you and bury the truth forever. Timothy will still be their hostage, and 43 families will never see justice. Sheriff Turner entered, his expression grave. Marshal, we've got trouble. Armed riders coming in from the north. Look like some of Augustus's old ranch hands. James nodded grimly. How many? 24, maybe more. And word is, Judge Carlton's reversed his testimony. Claims you coerced him at gunpoint. Sarah felt the walls closing in. Everything they'd uncovered, all the truth they'd fought to expose, was being buried under an avalanche of corruption and violence. James studied the growing crowd through the office window. Augustus's allies were gathering in the street, ranchers, corrupt officials, men with fortunes built on stolen land and murdered families. They wanted blood, and they didn't care whose. Sarah. James turned to her, his eyes intense. Do you trust me? She met his gaze steadily. Yes. Then, listen carefully. Augustus thinks he's won, but he's forgotten something important about Timothy's custody order. A slight smile touched his lips. Judge Morton may control Helena's court, but he has no authority over tribal land. Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. The Blackfeet Reservation, where my mother's people still live, where I spent 10 years, learning their ways after father died. James withdrew another telegram from his coat. I sent this 2 hours ago. Chief Running Bear remembers his nephew, and he's happy to grant sanctuary to a widow and her son. Sarah's heart leaped. You mean Timothy's already on his way there, escorted by tribal scouts I trust with my life. Augustus's men won't dare. Follow on to reservation land. Fresh tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, but this time from relief. Thank you, she whispered. But what about the evidence, the justice we fought for? Oh, we'll get justice. James's smile turned wolfish. Because while Augustus's friends were watching the territorial court, my fellow marshals were executing simultaneous raids on every compromised judge and land office in the territory. By now, copies of his ledgers are reaching the governor, the army commander, and every major newspaper from Denver to Chicago. The sound of hooves and angry voices grew louder outside. Sheriff Turner checked his rifle. They're almost here, Marshal. Good. James buckled on his gun belt. Sarah, there's a horse waiting behind the telegraph office. Billy knows the back trail to the reservation. You'll be with Timothy by nightfall. And you? I'm going to give Augustus's friends a lesson in federal authority. He touched her cheek gently. Go. Keep our evidence safe. I'll find you when it's over. Sarah caught his hand. Promise me you'll be careful. I promise. His eyes held hers for a moment longer. And Sarah, when this is finished, we should talk about your husband's land. That valley would be a fine place to raise a boy. The approaching mob's shouts nearly drowned out her response, but James saw it in her smile before she slipped away into the gathering dusk. Sarah urged her horse through the darkening pine forest, following Billy Jenkins along the narrow trail. The young telegraph operator seemed to know these back paths well, too well, she realized suddenly. Her heart skipped a beat as she noticed him checking the sun's position for the third time. Billy, she called out, pulling her horse to a stop. The reservation's north. We're heading west. He turned in his saddle, and the boyish innocence had vanished from his face. Clever woman. Guess that's why Augustus paid extra to make sure you didn't reach the Indians. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. You work for him. 3 years now. Billy's hand moved to his gun. Been his eyes and ears in the telegraph office. How do you think he stayed ahead of the law so long? Sarah's mind raced. Every telegram, every message between James and his fellow marshals. You warned the judges before the raids. Some of them. He smiled coldly. Enough to make sure the right evidence disappeared. Marshal Blackwood may have his mother's tribal connections, but Augustus has friends in higher places. The sound of approaching riders filtered through the trees, Billy's reinforcements coming to ensure she never reached Timothy. Why? She demanded, playing for time as she quietly gathered her reins. All those families Augustus destroyed. You saw the evidence. Evidence pays poorly, Mrs. Matthews. Augustus rewards loyalty generously. He drew his pistol. Now, if you'll... Sarah didn't let him finish. She wheeled her horse hard, its shoulder slamming into Billy's smaller mount. Man and horse went down in a tangle of limbs and curses. She kicked her horse into a gallop, ducking low as Billy's wild shot whistled past her ear. But which way? The forest was deepening into darkness, and she'd been too focused on Billy's betrayal to mark their true path. Behind her, voices shouted, and horses crashed through the underbrush. A sharp whistle cut through the chaos, 3 clear notes, like a meadowlark's call. Sarah remembered James teaching her the signal that morning. In case we get separated. She turned toward the sound, praying she wasn't riding into another trap. The pursuing horses were getting closer. A bullet splintered bark near her head. Then an answering meadowlark call, closer now. She burst through a screen of branches into a small clearing. 3 Blackfeet warriors sat their horses in the shadows, bows drawn and aimed at her pursuers. And there, in the center, was James. "Down!" he shouted. Sarah flattened against her horse's neck as arrows hissed overhead. Screams and cursing erupted behind her. Through the confusion, she heard Billy's voice rising in panic. "Augustus said nothing about Indians. This wasn't the deal." James's strong hand caught her reins, steadying her frightened mount. "Billy showed his true colors? You knew?" "Suspected. His telegrams were too perfect, too prompt." James's face was grim. "The messages about Timothy, the judge's custody order, all false. Augustus's last desperate play. Then Timothy is safe at the reservation as planned. I sent him with my most trusted scouts while Billy was busy betraying us to his master." He smiled slightly. "Never trust a man who's too eager to help." The warriors returned, reporting that their pursuers had fled. One of them led a struggling Billy, now tied and gagged. "What will happen to him?" Sarah asked. "He'll face federal charges for conspiracy and attempted murder. His testimony might even help us track down the judges and officials who escaped our raids." James turned to the warrior leader. "Running Deer, is the path still clear?" The tall Blackfeet nodded. "No more of Augustus's men between here and the village. The boy waits with my sister's family." Relief flooded through Sarah, but a new worry surfaced. "James, if Billy warned them about the raids, then Augustus's allies will be destroying evidence and covering their tracks." He nodded. "But they're too late." While Billy was feeding false telegrams to both sides, I was sending my real communications by Blackfeet runners. The governor has everything he needs. And Augustus? Tried to hang himself in his cell when he learned his friends couldn't save him. Failed at that, too. James's voice held no pity. Sheriff Turner's watching him personally now. The warriors were already moving out, Billy bouncing miserably on a LED horse. James helped Sarah remount, his hand lingering on hers. "I'm sorry about Billy," he said softly. "I wanted to warn you, but we needed him to think his plan was working." Sarah thought of the young man's cold smile, his casual dismissal of so many ruined lives. There's enough betrayal in this story already. At least this one failed. They rode north as the first stars appeared, following the warriors through paths known only to the people. Somewhere ahead, Timothy waited. And beyond that, Sarah realized, lay the promise of a future she'd thought lost forever. One built on truth instead of lies, justice instead of greed, and perhaps even love instead of loss. The jail cell's iron door creaked open. Augustus Blackwood sat on his cot, his once immaculate suit wrinkled, his silver hair unkempt. The failed hanging had left angry red marks on his neck, but his eyes, those remained as cold and calculating. "As ever, come to gloat, nephew." His voice was hoarse, but still carried that note of aristocratic disdain. James stepped inside, followed by Sarah. "Come to understand." "Understand?" Augustus laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "What's to understand? I built something magnificent, an empire of land and water that would have lasted centuries. And you," he spat the word, "destroyed it for sentiment, for justice," Sarah corrected quietly. Augustus's gaze swept over her dismissively. "Justice? Tell me, Mrs. Matthews, what justice is there in letting prime land lie fallow in the hands of ignorant homesteaders? Those people were nothing. Their death served a greater purpose, like my father's death." James's voice was dangerously soft. "What greater purpose did that serve?" "Your father was weak, just like you." Augustus stood, swaying slightly. He couldn't see the bigger picture. This territory needed strong men to shape it, to guide its destiny. The water rights alone were worth 44 murders. Sarah stepped closer to the bars. Worth orphaning all those children? Necessary sacrifices? Augustus's face took on an almost rapturous expression. "You can't build an empire without breaking things. Gerald understood that eventually, after I taught him. You destroyed your own brother." The disgust in James's voice was palpable. "I improved him, made him useful, Augustus smiled, remembering. He cried the first time, you know, when I made him poison that settler's well. 16 years old, soft as butter. But I showed him how power works, how the strong prosper while the weak perish. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. And Thomas, what was his crime? Curiosity. Augustus spat the word. He should have stayed focused on his tailoring instead of asking questions about water samples and dead livestock. Gerald actually liked him, wanted to offer him a place in our organization, but some dogs won't be trained. The casual cruelty of it staggered Sarah. You speak of murder like it's business. Everything is business, my dear. Life, death, justice, they're all commodities to be traded. He turned to James. Your father understood that at the end. In those last moments before the horse threw him, I saw it in his eyes. The recognition that all his principles meant nothing against simple, brutal force. James moved so fast, neither Sarah nor Augustus saw it coming. His hand shot through the bars, grabbing his uncle's collar, slamming him against the iron. Tell me why. Because I could. Augustus didn't resist, his smile growing wider. Because this land was meant for men like me to rule. Because every time I signed another deed, every time Gerald removed another obstacle, I was proving what I'd always known, that morality is a fence built by the weak to contain the strong. You're insane, Sarah whispered. I'm victorious. Augustus's eyes gleamed with fevered intensity. Oh, you'll hang me. I'll dance on air just like poor Gerald. But my empire, the foundations I laid, they'll outlast us all. There are 100 men like me out there, nephew. 1,000. Men who understand that power is the only truth. And that's why you tried to hang Sarah? James's grip tightened. To protect your truth? To teach a lesson? To show what happens to those who defy the natural order? Augustus's gaze fixed on Sarah with terrible clarity. Your son would have learned that lesson too, if my men had reached him. Some bloodlines need to be pruned for the greater good. The threat to Timothy broke something in Sarah. She reached through the bars and slapped Augustus with all her strength. The crack echoed off the stone walls. You'll never touch my son, she said, her voice shaking with rage. You'll never hurt another child, corrupt another soul, or steal another life. Your empire ends here, in this cell, with nothing but your madness for company. Augustus touched his reddened cheek, looking almost impressed. Spirit. I see why Gerald failed that night. But spirit changes nothing. The strong still devour the weak. The only difference is, now you'll have to watch it happen without me. James released his uncle with a look of pure disgust. No, uncle. The difference is, now we know what to watch for. Every land deed, every water right, every suspicious death. They'll all be examined through the lens of your crimes. Your legacy isn't empire, it's awareness. And memory, Sarah added softly. Every widow, every orphan, every grave, we'll remember. And we'll teach our children to remember, so men like you can never build empires on broken bodies again. They left him there, in his cell with his twisted philosophies and broken dreams. But his laughter followed them up the stairs, the sound of a man who, even in defeat, believed the world would always birth new monsters to replace him. The painting of First Light hung in Judge Morton's abandoned office, a serene landscape that belied the frantic activity below it. James and Sarah sorted through mountains of documents, while Sheriff Turner coordinated with arriving federal marshals. Via telegram. Judge Morton left in a hurry, Sarah noted, finding another hidden drawer in the massive oak desk. Half his papers are still here. He had to choose, James replied, examining land deeds under lamplight. Take the most incriminating evidence, or take his family silver. Based on the empty display cases, we know what mattered more to him. A young marshal burst in, breathing hard. Found something at the bank, sir, hidden safe behind Augustus's portrait. They hurried across the street, where workers were removing the massive oil painting of Augustus Blackwood from the bank's main wall. Behind it, set into the stonework, gleamed a state-of-the-art Diebold safe. "Can we crack it?" James asked. "Don't. Need to." Sarah stepped forward, studying the dial. "I know the combination." At their surprised looks, she smiled grimly. Thomas serviced Augustus's clothes for years. Rich men talk freely in front of tailors, especially about things that make them proud. Augustus couldn't resist bragging about his new safe. Her fingers moved, surely. Right to his wife's birth year, left to the date he founded the bank. Right to the amount of his first land purchase. The mechanism clicked, and the heavy door swung open. Inside lay a leather-bound book, its pages filled with Augustus's elegant script. His personal journal, James breathed, carefully lifting it out. The one Gerald mentioned in his confession to Billy. Sarah read over his shoulder as he opened it. Dear God! The journal detailed everything, not just the murders and land grabs, but Augustus's careful grooming of Gerald from childhood, his systematic corruption of local officials, even his orchestration of James's father's death. Each entry was written with the same cold precision he'd used for bank ledgers. He recorded it all, Sarah whispered, every crime, every manipulation, because he was proud of it. James's voice was hard. Each entry is a trophy, a reminder of his power. Sheriff Turner entered with more news. "Marshal, we've found 3 of the missing judges. They were trying to book passage to Canada from Fort Benton. Get their depositions immediately," James ordered, "before Augustus's friends can reach them." "Already done. And there's more. Judge Morton's wife sent this." Turner handed over a packet of letters. "Says she's tired of running, tired of the lies. These prove Augustus was bribing territorial officials as far back as 55. Sarah was still reading the journal, her face pale. "James, there's an entry about the night Thomas died. Augustus watched it happen. He stood outside our house and watched while Gerald poisoned our well." James gripped her shoulder as she swayed. "We'll add it to the evidence. Every detail, every crime, it all builds the case." "Time's against us," Turner reminded them. "Augustus's trial starts at noon. His lawyers are already crying about rushed justice. Then we'll give them more justice than they can handle." James began organizing the documents. "Sarah, can you testify about the journal, confirm the combination, explain how you knew it?" She straightened, steel entering her spine. "I'll tell them everything. About Thomas, about Gerald's attack, about Billy's betrayal. No more secrets." A commotion outside drew them to the window. A wagon train was arriving. Families filing into town, some on foot, some on horseback. Sarah recognized faces she'd seen. In Augustus's ledgers, widows, orphans, survivors. Words spread. Turner said softly. "They've come to see justice done." Some carried photographs of dead husbands, others clutched deeds to stolen lands. Children walked beside parents who'd aged, too soon from grief. All bore witness to Augustus's crimes. He thought they were weak, Sarah murmured, that they'd stay broken and silent. Instead, they're his judgment. James watched as more witnesses arrived. Each face tells a story his lawyers can't explain. Away, the morning sun climbed higher, painting Redemption Creek's buildings in gold. In his cell, Augustus waited, still believing in the power of his money and connections. But here, in the growing light, truth was gathering like a flood. Sarah touched the locket at her throat, thinking of Timothy's safe with James's tribal family. "When this is over," she said, "we should make sure their stories are recorded, not just as evidence, but as memory." "A testament," James agreed, "so no one forgets what happened here." The clock struck 11. In 1 hour, Augustus Blackwood would face not just the law, but the living proof of every life he'd tried to destroy. And in that hour, Sarah and James raced to ensure that not one detail, not one crime, not one victim would be forgotten or denied. The courthouse creaked under the weight of history and humanity. Every bench was filled, every aisle crowded with those who'd come to see justice done. Sarah sat in the front row, the weight of Augustus's journal in her lap, while James conferred. quietly with the federal prosecutor. Then the side door burst open. Augustus's lawyers swept in, their expressions triumphant. "Your Honor," the lead attorney announced, "we have new evidence that demands an immediate dismissal." The federal judge, a weathered man named Harrison, peered over his spectacles. "Proceed," Devillos. Lawyer produced a set of prison keys with a flourish. These were found in Marshal Blackwood's saddlebag. Proof that he planned to help the defendant escape, then conveniently kill him while preventing that escape. A murmur ran through the crowd. Sarah's heart stopped as she recognized the keys, the ones Billy had planted before his capture. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, "We have a sworn statement from the telegraph operator, William Jenkins, testifying that Marshal Blackwood coerced him into sending false messages about Judge Morton and others." James stood slowly. "Your Honor, I can explain." "You can explain from a cell," Augustus's lawyer smirked. "Bailiff, arrest this man for conspiracy and evidence tampering." "Wait." Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. She rose, clutching the journal. "Before you act on the word of a confessed conspirator, you should hear what Augustus wrote about Billy Jenkins." The judge held up his hand as the bailiff reached for James. "What do you mean, Mrs. Matthews?" Sarah opened the journal to a marked page. August 15th, 1873. Young Jenkins proves more useful than expected. His position in the telegraph office lets him monitor all law enforcement communications. Today he warned me of a pending investigation, giving me time to hide the Wilkinson deed. His greed makes him perfectly controllable. The lawyer's face reddened. "Objection. That journal is inadmissible. Because you didn't know we'd found it," James asked quietly, "hidden in the bank safe whose combination you tried to destroy." Sarah continued reading. "Jenkins suggested planting evidence on my nephew if he ever came sniffing around. The boy has a real talent for treachery. Must remember to reward him appropriately." Augustus, who had been sitting in smug silence, suddenly lunged forward. "She's lying. That journal is a forgery." "Then you won't mind us comparing the handwriting to your bank records," the federal prosecutor said smoothly. "The ones we recovered from Judge Morton's office this morning." The courthouse doors opened again. Two federal marshals led in a shackled Billy Jenkins. The young man's face was ashen. "Mr. Jenkins," Judge Harrison called, "are you prepared to testify under oath about who ordered you to plant those keys?" Billy looked at Augustus, then at the packed courthouse. All those faces, all those lives, destroyed by the lies he'd helped maintain. I want to change my statement." Augustus surged to his feet. "You miserable little—" His hand emerged from his coat, holding a small Derringer pistol that had somehow escaped the bailiff's search. Several things happened at once. Augustus fired at Sarah, aiming for the journal that could destroy him. James dove forward, knocking her down as the bullet whined overhead. And from the gallery, Martha Whitaker hurled her heavy iron keyring with surprising accuracy, catching Augustus's gun hand. The weapon clattered to the floor. Augustus found himself staring down the barrels of a dozen guns, marshals, deputies, and even Judge Harrison's own revolver. "I believe," the judge said dryly, "we can add attempted murder in a federal courthouse to the charges." Sarah got to her feet, helped by James's steady hand. The journal was intact, its damning contents preserved. She looked at Augustus, seeing not the powerful banker who'd terrorized the territory, but a desperate old man whose empire of lies was crumbling. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "I'd like to resume my testimony now, about the night Thomas died and everything that followed." "Proceed, Mrs. Matthews." The judge's eyes were kind but firm. "Let's have the whole truth." As Sarah took the witness stand, she saw Augustus's facade finally crack. The mask of aristocratic disdain fell away, revealing the horror of a man watching. His life's work dissolve into ashes. James caught her eye as she began to speak. In his gaze, she saw not just support, but something deeper, a shared understanding that justice, like love, required both courage and faith to bloom. And so, before the packed courthouse, Sarah told their story. not just hers and Thomas's, but the story of every family Augustus had tried to destroy. With each word, each detail, each remembered grief, she felt the chains of fear and doubt falling away. The truth, so long buried, was finally rising into the light. An old war badge lay on the prosecutor's table, its silver surface dulled with age. James touched it briefly before rising to give his testimony, drawing strength from his father's final gift to him. "Marshal Blackwood," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court what you discovered about your father's death." The courthouse fell silent. Even the afternoon wind seemed to hold its breath outside the windows. Augustus sat rigid in his chair, his mask of indifference cracking at the edges. "My father, William Blackwood, served as a territorial marshal for 20 years, James began, his voice steady. In the spring of 1853, he began investigating a pattern of homesteader deaths along Copper Creek. At first they appeared natural, illness, accidents, bad water. But he noticed something. Every deceased homesteader had refused to sell their land to Blackwood Holdings. Sarah watched from her seat as James methodically laid out the evidence, just as his father had taught him. Each fact, each connection, each devastating conclusion fell like hammer blows on Augustus's carefully constructed facade. On April 15, 1853, my father wrote this letter. James held up a weathered envelope. He sent it to the territorial governor. But Augustus's men in the postal service intercepted it. "We found it in the bank vault this morning." The prosecutor nodded. "Please read it to the court." James broke the seal his father had pressed 20 years ago. "To Governor Harrison Davis, I write with grave concerns regarding my brother Augustus's business dealings. I have confirmed that the deaths along Copper Creek were deliberate poisonings, orchestrated through a complex scheme of water rights manipulation and corrupt officials. More disturbing still, I've discovered my brother is grooming my younger nephew Gerald for involvement in these crimes, teaching him to value power over human life. I fear I may not live to bring this evidence to light. If you're reading this, I beg you to investigate the land deeds of every deceased homesteader. The pattern will become clear, as will the blood on my brother's hands. With deepest urgency, Marshal William Blackwood." Augustus's lawyer jumped up. "Objection! This is hearsay from a long-dead man who was murdered the very next day." James cut in, producing another document. "This is the report from a Blackfeet medicine man who examined my father's body. He found traces of the same poison used in the Copper Creek wells. Augustus didn't trust Gerald yet, with such an important kill. He handled this one personally," the lawyer sputtered, but Judge Harrison silenced him with a look. "Continue, Marshal. My father's death was ruled an accident, a fall from his horse. But this badge," James touched the silver star, "was found clutched in his hand. On the back, he'd managed to scratch one word: Augustus." A low murmur ran through the courthouse. Augustus's face had gone grey, his hands trembling slightly as his carefully constructed world continued to unravel. "And now," James said, turning to face his uncle directly, 20 years later, history nearly repeated itself. Another honest man, Thomas Matthews, discovered the truth. Another poisoned well, another family destroyed, or so you thought. Sarah stood, still holding Augustus's journal. "But Thomas outsmarted you. He sent copies of the evidence to Denver, just like James's father did. Only this time, the truth couldn't be buried." "Lies," Augustus whispered, but his voice held no conviction. "All lies." "No, Uncle, just delayed justice." James removed his own marshal's badge, letting it catch the light. "You see, Father taught me one last lesson the day he died. He taught me that truth, like poison, leaves traces that can't be washed away. That justice, like a well-trained marshal, never stops hunting its prey." The prosecutor stepped forward with a final piece of evidence. A water sample from the Matthews well, preserved by the Denver assayer's office. The same poison that killed William Blackwood had been found in its depths. Augustus seemed to age. Decades in moments, his empire of lies collapsing under the weight of preserved truth. But as the bailiff approached to return him to his cell, he rallied one last time. "You're all fools," he snarled. "This territory wasn't built by honest men with badges. It was built by men like me, who understood that power is the only law that matters." "No, uncle." James's voice was almost gentle. "It was built by the people you tried to destroy. By widows who rebuilt, children who remembered, and good men who died protecting the truth. Their law is the one that endures." As Augustus was led away, Sarah moved to James's side. Together they watched the sun setting through the courthouse, windows painting the sky in colors of healing and hope. The badge on the table caught the last light, its silver surface reflecting not just justice delayed, but justice finally, irrevocably served. The jury filed back into the courthouse just as dawn touched the eastern sky. They deliberated through the night, carrying the weight of 20 years of crimes on their shoulders. Sarah gripped the wooden railing before her, knuckles white. James stood beside her, steady as a mountain. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Harrison's voice carried through the hushed chamber. The foreman stood, a weathered rancher whose own brother had died mysteriously after refusing to sell his water rights. "We have, Your Honor." Augustus sat like a statue, his aristocratic bearing intact even in defeat. Only his eyes, darting between the jurors' faces, betrayed his fear. "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of William Blackwood, how do you find?" "Guilty." A soft exhale, like wind through prairie grass, swept through the gathered crowd. "On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Thomas Matthews." "Guilty." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling Thomas's presence beside her, his justice finally secured. "On the 42 additional counts of murder through criminal conspiracy and poisoning." "Guilty on all counts." The foreman's voice grew stronger with each pronouncement, as if speaking for every victim, every widow, every orphaned child. "On the charges of land fraud, corruption of public officials, and obstruction of justice." "Guilty." Augustus's facade cracked. For the first time, terror showed naked on his face as he realized that not one charge, not one crime, had escaped judgment. Judge Harrison lifted his gavel. "Augustus Blackwood, please rise." He stood on trembling legs, his fine suit hanging loose on a frame that had shrunk during his imprisonment. "This court has rarely witnessed crimes of such calculated malice, such sustained evil," the judge began. "You murdered your own brother. You corrupted your younger nephew. You poisoned wells and stole land and destroyed families with the dispassion of a man balancing ledgers." Augustus tried to speak, but the judge silenced him with a look. "The prosecution has proven 44 murders by your hand or order. 44 lives ended for profit. Hundreds more ruined through your greed. The law permits only one sentence for crimes of this magnitude." The gavel fell like thunder. "You are hereby sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out 1 month. Hence, additionally, all properties and assets of Blackwood Holdings are to be returned to the families of your victims or their heirs." A different sound filled the courthouse now, not cheers or celebration, but the quiet sobs of survivors, finally letting themselves feel the full weight of their losses and their vindication. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "this court recognizes the extraordinary service of Marshal James Blackwood and Mrs. Sarah Matthews in bringing these crimes to light. Their courage in the face of corruption and violence stands as a testament to the true strength of law in these territories." James squeezed Sarah's hand as Augustus was led away, his shoulders bowed under the weight of justice. But at the door he turned one last time. "You think this ends with me?" His voice cracked with bitterness. "There will always be men like me, always be power-crushing weakness." "No, Augustus," Sarah's clear voice cut through his darkness. "There will always be people like Thomas, like William, like James, people willing to die for truth. And now, thanks to you, we know how to spot the poison in the well." As if her words had broken a spell, morning light suddenly poured through the courthouse windows, touching each face with gold. The light reached Augustus too, but found nothing to illuminate, only shadows where a human soul should have been. After he was gone, Judge Harrison addressed the crowded room. This trial has exposed more than one man's crimes. It has shown us how power can corrupt, how greed can poison not just wells, but hearts. Let the records show that justice prevailed not through force of arms or wealth, but through the courage of common people who refused to let truth die. He turned to Sarah. And James, Mrs. Matthews, the territory extends its deepest apologies for your wrongful arrest and near execution. Your husband's sacrifice, like Marshal William Blackwood's, helped build the foundation for a more just society. Sarah nodded, tears flowing freely now. Thomas would be proud, not just of the justice, but of how the community came together to make it happen. Outside, the town was awakening to a new day. Riders were already heading out, carrying news of Augustus's conviction to distant homesteads and settlements. Soon everyone would know that the shadow over Redemption Creek had finally lifted. "What happens now?" Sarah asked softly. James smiled, touching the badge that had been his father's. "Now we rebuild. Return the stolen lands. Restore the poisoned wells. Help healing replace fear. Together." The word hung in the morning air like a promise, as bright and true as the dawn. Morning roses bloomed along the path to the Blackfeet camp, their wild sweetness a stark contrast to the manicured gardens Augustus had once maintained. Sarah walked slowly, drinking in the peaceful scene before her. After weeks of testimony and trials, the simple beauty of flowers felt like a healing balm. "Mama!" Timothy's voice carried across the clearing, and suddenly she had an armful of growing boy, his face pressed into her shoulder. She held him tight, breathing in the scent of pine needles and childhood that no prison cell or courtroom could erase. "I helped build a real tipi," he announced proudly, pulling back to see her face. "And running deer taught me to track rabbits. And I learned 3 Blackfeet words, and you've grown at least an inch," she laughed, smoothing his wild curls. It had been just weeks, but the haunted look she'd feared to find in his eyes was gone, replaced by the sparkle of adventure. "The people have been good teachers," James said, approaching with Chief Running Bear. "He has a warrior's heart, like his father." The chief nodded gravely. "The boy brings honor to both his families now." Sarah felt tears threatening. These people, who owed her nothing, had protected her son as their own. "I can never repay." "There is nothing to repay," Running Bear interrupted gently. "Your fight against the poison maker was our fight too. His wells killed our people as surely as yours." A young woman approached, carrying a bundle wrapped in soft-tanned deerskin. "A gift," she said, offering it to Sarah. "From the women of the camp." Inside lay a beautiful morning star quilt, its patterns telling a story of darkness yielding to dawn. "It's extraordinary," Sarah breathed, touching the intricate stitching. "You are a woman who walked through night to find the morning," the chief's wife explained, "like the star that guides us home." Timothy touched the quilt with careful fingers. "Can we hang it in our new house, Mama?" "New house." Sarah looked questioningly at James, who shifted almost boyishly. "I was going to wait to tell you," he said, "but the territorial governor approved the transfer this morning. All the stolen properties are being returned, including—" He pulled. "Note a deed, including Thomas's land in Paradise Valley." Sarah stared at the document, remembering Thomas's dreams for that fertile valley. "But that's your family's land too, which makes it perfectly right that family should live there again." James's eyes held hers. "If you want it." The meaning behind his words hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Timothy looked between them, hope dawning on his face. "Does this mean we're staying with Marshal James, if that's what your mama wants?" James said softly. Sarah touched the locket at her throat, feeling Thomas's presence like a gentle blessing. He'd always said love was like his garden. Plant it in good soil, tend it with care, and watch it grow. "The valley has the best soil in the territory," she said carefully, a smile tugging at her lips. "Would be a shame to waste it." James's answering smile could have lit the dawn. Timothy whooped and threw himself at them both, nearly knocking them over. Running Bear's deep chuckle rolled across the clearing. Then we will have a feast to celebrate new beginnings. That evening, as the sunset painted the mountains gold, the people gathered to share food and stories. Timothy sat with the other children, listening wide-eyed to tales of brave deeds and ancient wisdom. Sarah watched him from her place by the fire, marveling at how naturally he moved between two worlds. "He'll grow strong here," James said, settling beside her. "With the valley's bounty below and the people's courage above, and justice between," Sarah added, thinking of all they'd accomplished. "Speaking of which, how goes the restoration?" "Better than hoped. Most of the stolen deeds have been returned. The territorial courts are being reformed. Even the wells are being cleaned, though it will take time for the land to heal completely." "Like its people," she murmured. James took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "Sarah, I know it might be too soon." "It's not." She turned to face him fully. "Thomas taught me that love isn't a betrayal of the past, but a bridge to the future. And you," she squeezed his hand, "you helped me find justice, protected my son, and showed me that broken things can be rebuilt stronger than before." Above them, the evening star emerged, bright as hope. Timothy's laughter mingled with the ancient songs of the people, while the wild roses released their sweetness to the gathering night. Here, Sarah thought, was everything Thomas had died protecting: family, justice, and the promise of tomorrow. The old family Bible lay open on the kitchen table of their new home in Paradise Valley, its pages catching the late summer light. Sarah watched as James carefully wrote in the family record, "Timothy Matthews Blackwood, adopted with love and gratitude, August 15th, 1874. "There," he said, letting the ink dry. "It's official in every way that matters." Timothy traced his new name with a reverent finger. "Can I write in it too?" "Of course." James handed him the pen. "What would you like to add?" The boy thought carefully, then wrote in his careful school hand, "Mama smiled today like she used to before Papa died." Sarah's heart caught at the simple observation. She hugged Timothy close, breathing in the sunshine scent of his hair. "That's because I'm happy, darling. We all are." The valley stretched beyond their windows, green and golden in the August heat. Thomas's dreams for the land were already taking shape. Orchards planted, fields fenced, clean wells dug far from the poisoned ones. But it was inside this house that the real miracle was unfolding. "Tell me about him again," James said later, as they sat on the porch watching Timothy help Running Deer's grandson break a young horse. "About Thomas." Sarah touched her locket, a gesture that had become one of remembrance rather than grief. "He would have liked you. Your dedication to justice, your gentleness with Timothy." She smiled. "He always said a man's true character shows in how he treats those who can't repay him." "Is that why he helped so many homesteaders, even when it put him at risk?" "He believed in people, in community." Sarah watched Timothy master a particularly difficult mounting technique. "Like how you believe in Timothy's strength, even when he doubts himself." James nodded toward the boys. "Running Deer says Timothy has medicine horse dreams. The gift of understanding horses' spirits, says it's rare among any people." They watched as Timothy calmed the nervous colt with quiet words and sure hands, so different from the frightened boy who'd hidden from Augustus's men, yet still carrying his father's gentle heart. "I've been thinking," James said carefully, "about changing the valley's name. Blackwood carries too many dark memories now." "What did you have in mind?" "Matthews Valley, to honor the man whose courage made this possible." Sarah's eyes misted. "Thomas would say the valley belongs to its people, not to any one name. Then we'll ask them to choose. The homesteaders, the Blackfeet, everyone who calls this land home." James took her hand. "That's what rebuilding means. Giving voice to those who were silenced." Inside, the Bible's pages rustled in the evening breeze. Sarah thought of all the names written there, generations of Blackwoods and Matthews, now joined in a new story. "Speaking of names," she said softly, Timothy wrote his own in the family Bible this morning, under children. James's grip tightened. And you're comfortable with that, with him taking my name? He chose it himself. Said he wanted to honor 3 fathers, Thomas who gave him life, you who gave him a future, and William who taught you both to stand for truth. Their conversation paused as Timothy galloped past, whooping in triumph as the colt responded perfectly. To his commands, Running Deer's grandson followed, calling praise in mixed Blackfeet and English. 3 cultures, James mused. 3 traditions of honor and courage. He'll grow strong from all of them. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, feeling the rightness of this moment. Thomas used to say that love grows best in rich soil. This valley, she gestured to the fertile land around them. It's not just earth and water, it's story and memory and hope and family, James added. Speaking of which, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small package. I had this made in Helena. Inside lay a new locket, larger than her old one. When she opened it, she found 3 miniature photographs. Thomas smiling in his Sunday best, Timothy astride his first horse, and James in his marshal's uniform. The past and present together, he explained. Where they belong. Sarah touched each image gently. Perfect, she whispered. Absolutely perfect. As sunset painted the valley in shades of promise, Timothy rode back to the house, his face glowing with accomplishment. The young horse followed trustingly, having found its partnership. With a boy who spoke its language. "Mama, James, did you see?" "We saw," they answered together, then laughed at the harmony of their response. The family Bible waited inside, its pages open to record more joy, more growth, more love. And somewhere, Sarah thought, Thomas was smiling at the harvest, his sacrifice had yielded, a family rebuilt, a valley restored, and a future bright with possibility. The wedding ring caught the October sunlight as James slipped it onto Sarah's finger. Simple gold, inscribed with 3 words: justice, truth, love. Around them the valley blazed with autumn colors, as if nature herself had decorated for the celebration. In accordance with the laws of the territory and by the ancient customs of the people, Running Bear intoned in his deep voice, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The gathered crowd erupted in cheers, homesteaders in their Sunday best, Blackfeet in ceremonial dress, and at the front, Timothy beaming in his new suit. He held a beaded medicine pouch Running Bear had given him, symbolizing his place in both worlds. Martha Whitaker dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Thomas would be so pleased," she whispered to her husband. "Look how the valley's come alive again." Indeed, the changes were remarkable. Where poisoned wells had once tainted the land, clean water now flowed. The stolen properties had been returned, and new orchards were already setting fruit. But the most profound transformation was in the people themselves. Sarah looked out at the faces of those gathered, widows who'd reclaimed their land, children who'd found new families, a community that had risen from the ashes of Augustus's crimes. Many wore the morning star pattern, symbolizing hope after darkness, sewn by the skilled hands of both settler and Blackfeet women working together. "Friends," James addressed the crowd, his voice carrying across the valley. 20 years ago, my father died protecting the truth about this land. Today, we celebrate not just a marriage, but a promise that truth and justice will always find their defenders. He turned to Sarah, his eyes bright with emotion. "And love will always find its way home." Timothy stepped forward then, carrying a small cedar box. Inside lay 3 items: Thomas's old locket, William's marshal's badge, and a fresh rose from the garden Sarah had planted in spring. "The old and the new," Timothy explained, just as they'd practiced. "Like our family." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the locket and badge, pinning them together over her heart. The rose she tucked into her bouquet of wildflowers, gathered by the Blackfeet children. Running Bear raised his hands in blessing, first in his own language, then in English. May your union be strong as the mountains, deep as the valleys, and true as the stars that guide us home. The celebration that followed blended traditions as naturally as the families had blended. Blackfeet drums accompanied settler fiddles. Children played games from both cultures. The feast featured both traditional pemmican and Martha's famous beef stew. As evening approached, Sarah found a quiet moment with James near the old apple tree Thomas had planted. "Look," she said, pointing to where Timothy sat with a mixed group of children, teaching them how to speak with horses using gentle hands and quiet words. "A bridge between worlds," James murmured. "Like his mother." Sarah touched the badges at her throat. "Like his father's. All of them." The sound of approaching hooves drew their attention. A rider approached at an easy pace, and Sarah recognized the territorial governor's seal on his saddlebag. "Marshal Blackwood," the rider called, dismounting with a smile. "Or should I say Chief Marshal?" James straightened. "Sir, just signed the order this morning." The governor handed over an official document. "The territory's creating a new law, enforcement division, one dedicated to investigating land fraud and protecting homesteader rights. After what happened here, we need people who know what to look for." Sarah read over James's shoulder. "The Matthews Blackwood Commission for Land Justice, named for 2 men who died protecting the truth," the governor explained, "and 1 man who made sure that truth came to light." He turned to Sarah. "We'd like you on the commission too, Mrs. Blackwood. Your experience with both sides of justice makes you uniquely qualified." Sarah felt James squeeze her hand. "We'd be honored," she answered for them both. As the sun set, lanterns were lit throughout the valley. Their light caught the ring on Sarah's finger, making the inscription glow. Justice, truth, love. Not just words anymore, but a legacy built from sacrifice and hope. Timothy joined them, leading his favorite horse. "Running Deer says the stars are bright tonight because the ancestors are celebrating too." Sarah looked up at the emerging evening star, thinking of Thomas and William watching over their valley. The old wounds were healing, transformed like the land itself into something stronger and more beautiful than before. "They are celebrating," James agreed, drawing his new family close. "The victory of light over darkness, of truth over lies, of love over fear." Around them, the valley hummed with music, laughter, and the promise of tomorrow. And in that moment, Sarah knew that this wasn't just an ending to their story, but a beginning, one that would be told and retold, reminding future generations that justice, like love, could bloom even in the hardest soil. 1 year later, the family portrait hung in the Valley Courthouse's main hall, a testament to how much could change in a single turning of the seasons. Sarah and James stood together, Timothy between them, all 3 smiling beneath the morning star quilt that served as a backdrop. But it was more than just a family image. It was a symbol of everything Matthews Valley had become. The courthouse itself told the story. Once Augustus's bank, the building had been transformed into a center of true justice. The commission's offices occupied the upper floor, where Sarah and James worked together, protecting homesteader rights across the territory. Maps covered the walls, each marking protected waters and preserved lands. In the past year alone, they'd prevented 3 attempts to replicate Augustus's schemes in other territories. "Mama! Papa!" Timothy's voice echoed through the building as he burst in, still dusty from his morning ride. "The apple trees are blooming, all of them." Sarah set aside the land claim she'd been reviewing and followed her son outside. There, stretching across the valley floor, Thomas's orchards had exploded into white blossoms. The sight brought happy tears to her eyes. His dream finally realized. "Beautiful, isn't it?" James joined them, slipping an arm around her waist. His marshal's badge gleamed alongside the smaller commission pin they both wore. "The sweetest kind of justice," she agreed, touching the locket that still held 3 photographs and generations of love. Timothy pointed excitedly to where a group of Blackfeet and settler children played together near the schoolhouse. "Miss Wilson says we're getting 2 new families next week. running deers, helping them build their homes. The valley had become a model of cooperation, drawing visitors from across the territory who wanted to learn how two cultures could work together so seamlessly. The poisoned wells were now marked with warning totems carved by Blackfeet artists, turning sites of death into memorials of remembrance and warning. "Have you told them your news?" James asked Timothy with a proud smile. The boy straightened. "The tribal council asked me to help train their horses for the summer gathering. They say I have medicine horse dreams like the old ones." Sarah hugged him close, marveling at how he'd grown. At 10, he was already showing signs of the man he'd become, one who could bridge worlds and heal hurts, just as this valley had done. A rider approached, carrying the governor's seal. More work for the commission, no doubt. There would always be those who followed Augustus's dark path, believing that power meant more than people. But now there was also always someone watching, ready to defend the truth. The evening star appeared early, bright against the blue sky. Sarah remembered Thomas's words about love growing in rich soil. Here in this valley, justice and love had indeed grown together, spreading roots deep into the earth and branches high toward heaven. "Ready to head home?" James asked softly. Sarah looked at her family, the son who carried 3 fathers' legacies, the husband who had helped her find justice and new love, and the valley that had transformed from a place of death to one of abundant life. "Yes," she said, knowing Thomas would understand that she was finally truly home. "We're ready,"